Hi, Dave Littman here from Truth in IT, and welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is sponsored by Arcserve and KnowBe4, and we'll post links to both those sites so you can check them out later if you want. Just a couple housekeeping tips. This webinar will be under an hour. We're going to go through some Q&A with our representatives from Arcserve and KnowBe4 first. Then we will be taking your questions at the end. But you can submit your questions throughout the broadcast. Just use the chat panel. We'll be collecting them, and then we'll be answering them at the end. So I'm going to be bringing on, without further ado, Christophe Bertrand of Arcserve and Eric Krohn of KnowBe4. So hang on one second. I'm going to bring them on. Okay, guys, are you here? I think I see you. You guys are online.
Yes, we're here.
All right, Eric, welcome. So first, let's say hi to Christophe Bertrand. Christophe is VP of Product Marketing with Arcserve. Christophe, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me today.
All right, thanks for being here. And we're also speaking with Eric Krohn. Eric is Security Awareness Advocate of KnowBe4. Eric, welcome.
Thank you very much. This should be fun.
It will be fun, that's for sure. And so everybody who's watching, hey, just submit your questions through the chat panel. We're going to save them till the end. Without further ado, let's get going. What we all are talking about here today is ransomware. How real is it? How much should we be worried about it? And assuming it is a real thing to be worried about, how do we prepare for it? And how do we react and recover from it if it happens? So, Eric, let me start with you. How real of an issue is this? How much should our audience be worried? Is this a question of if, or is it a question of when?
Yeah, so it's very real. There's no doubt about that. I do a lot of talking at different conferences and things like that, and it never fails to have a group of people going, yeah, we got hit, or somebody I know got hit, and it was a pretty nasty thing. It was pretty ugly. And honestly, the way that it's growing, as quickly as it's growing, I think it increased about 750% last year, and we expect more this year. You can pretty much expect sooner or later, if you run a business, you're going to get hit by ransomware. So you need to be ready for it. That's really what it boils down to.
And is it discriminatory? Is it big companies? Is it small companies? Is one, do you think, more susceptible than another?
No, not really. I think it hits everybody. And not only does it hit large and small companies, it hits individuals as well. They get hit at home, and certain things happen. There's been cases where folks have been infected at home and ended up bringing things into the office and infecting the office. So it doesn't really matter who you are, size, individual or company. Now, there are some strains that will focus on companies more than individuals, just due to the way that they traverse around a network and things like that. But nobody's safe from this.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Eric. So, Christophe, Eric is seeing it a bit from a different perspective, sort of before the issue happens in many cases. You're seeing it from the perspective of after it happens. So what are you seeing with your customers? Is this a thing that our audience should worry about?
Absolutely. It is a very, very critical problem. The frequency of occurrence has literally exploded in the past few quarters. We get a lot more customers actually telling us and thanking us for helping them recover from those issues, because in essence, ransomware is a disaster recovery type of situation. It is the corruption of data. It's a logical corruption. In the past, it used to be that an application would fail, something would go wrong, or whatever the case may be, and you'd have to go rebuild that system, rebuild that application, rebuild that database. Well, now it's ransomware, and as Eric indicated, coming from endpoints, coming from all sorts of places on the web, and it has become really a plague in many organizations of all sizes.
Okay. And, sometimes things like this, they can get overblown, they can get underestimated. So, Christophe, building upon what you were saying, what are you hearing out there that are misconceptions? Can you help separate the myth from the reality?
Sure. Well, so a couple of things that I think are very important. And number one, there is a misconception that Linux environments, for example, just to take one example, are immune to ransomware. And that's not true. Actually, recent statistics demonstrate that it has become really a pretty favorable ground, unfortunately. And I would say that's going to be the case across pretty much every environment. That's number one. The other is that there is quite a bit of hype around early detection and trying to detect when encryption happens and something goes wrong, etc. Well, that's interesting. It's like the weatherman telling me it's raining outside, right? Thanks. I could have figured that out myself. The issue is that the predictive aspects of ransomware, I think, are, and again, that's a security question. I think the backup vendors should focus on backup and recovery. The predictive aspects, I think, are really not quite convincing as far as I'm concerned. The minute you start seeing encryption or something locks up, it's too late. It's already executed. And then it begs the question of, well, if that's happened, where is it exactly? How do I clean it up? And then what have I really lost? And am I going to take a chance that I've created some instability in my data or some incoherence in it? So these are the type of things that we see, and some misconceptions that it only attacks specific OSs, or it can be stopped very quickly when you see it. Maybe not. I think that's where key technologies and the security side of things come in.
Okay, and it seems like that this is not only an issue of before and after. It's an issue of educating different camps within the corporation. It's educating IT. It's educating end users. Eric, tell us a little bit about how IT should be preparing itself. What are the steps that they can take? And then we'll talk about end users.
Right. So, like you said, it's a matter of everybody being aware of this, right? And everybody's got a little bit different role to play in it, from the users to the IT folks. Obviously, we're big on training people. They have to be aware of the risk to understand what's going on. But then I think in a lot of cases, organizations, especially in the SMB side, we're starting to forget about some of the security 101 stuff. That used to be very prevalent back in the days when you just had a firewall and the rest. But things like segmenting your network so that things cannot spread throughout your network if you're hit by things. Doing those sorts of things, principle of least privilege, reducing what rights people have to go and infect these files. Because typically, like, ransomware fires off in the context of the user that launched it. So if the user doesn't have the rights to be able to encrypt those files or modify those files won't be damaged. And it's up to the IT folks really to kind of also understand what's going on within the trends that are happening there and what does and doesn't protect you. Because I've also been asked a number of times by even IT folks that if a file is already encrypted, is it safe from ransomware? And the answer is no, it's not. It can still be encrypted. You still can't get it back. And so they need to be keeping up on those sorts of things.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Christoph, what are you seeing from an IT perspective? What would your advice be? And we're going to talk more about disaster recovery later, but from an IT perspective, in terms of helping them prepare.
Well, so obviously, the question of backup and having recent recovery points and being able to recover quickly, these are the two big things IT can do against any sort of attack when the time comes to recover. But I would say in the same sort of vein, understanding that you have a solution that allows you to control access to the backup server, some very strong execution in terms of the ability to control access rights, administrative rights, positioning or making sure the backup data itself is in a place on the network that cannot be easily accessed by other users, etc. So these are best practices you would have to apply across the board, even maybe more so to your backup environment. And then in terms of best practices, always practice the offline copy and multiple copies, regardless of what you do from a backup and recovery perspective.
Well, it's interesting that you brought that up. So we're going to be posting a graphic at the end of the webinar, and it is a summary of the 5 sort of must-haves for preventing and recovering from ransomware. And so you guys mentioned 2. One, Christoph, you just mentioned was backing up your data and having a copy at a remote site. And we'll talk in more detail about that. But I want to come back to a point that Eric made. I want to make sure the audience knows it and understands it, because it is one of the other 5 must-haves. And it's called the principle of least privilege. Eric, can you explain what that is? And we want to make sure the audience knows it.
Sure. Essentially, the principle of least privilege is giving people only the access that they need to do their job, right? Not everybody should be an admin. Not everybody should be a domain admin. Not everybody should have the keys to the kingdom. If they don't need that, then it's important to eliminate those permissions and those rights from the people, because that's how things do go from inconvenient to horribly wrong, is when people like your receptionist can access all of the files in accounting and things like that. And that goes beyond the ransomware piece, but insider threat and all of those things. It's a very basic principle of information security. But in many cases, I think organizations have gotten really tied up in the technology and throwing out new technical solutions, and they're kind of forgetting about some of the foundational things. I see it an awful lot in the smaller and medium-sized businesses.
And Christoph, from a backup perspective, does that principle apply there as well?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the question is, do you know, first of all, who your staff is? Start with the threats from within, and then also apply best practices and sound practices on the management piece of the actual backup environment. Again, with the right administrative rights. Not everybody has the right to back up everything, or has the right to recover everything, or even has access to the software or the appliance, whatever the case may be. The other thing is, be smart. Don't go open up your webmail on that backup server. Okay, don't click on that link when you're on a backup server. You can wait. Your mail will wait in the mailbox. So these are some simple things. They sound a bit silly as I say them, but they're not. We've heard this before, believe me.
Yeah, and so the backup admin can click on that file. It can not only corrupt the server itself, but the backup data as well.
Correct. And again, that's why you have to have copies offline, meaning they could be offline off-site or offline on-site, as well as some, again, sound practices to mitigate the impact on the backup server.
Yeah. So it's sort of like, I'm thinking of sailing a ship, like, I don't know, the Titanic comes to mind, right? So you've got the crew that has to be trained, but they also want the passengers to have some level of protocol, some level of training. They should know where the lifeboats are. They should be aware of signs of trouble. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the passengers on this hypothetical boat that I'm using as a metaphor. Eric, you guys are involved with helping the end users become aware of threats and things like this. So take us through some of the mechanics behind the content that they should be trained on, and how they should be trained, and what IT needs to be aware of when it comes time to educating their customers.
Okay. One thing I do want to say is, we not only concentrate on the end users, just your average Joes, but we also think it's very important that we concentrate on your leadership as well. Leadership has to be aware of the threats that are out there that they're facing. In many cases, they don't understand how bad it is until something happens. So, somebody gets hit with a CEO fraud attack or something like that, and a lot of money goes out. That can be a real problem. And how many times have we had executives, that don't want this software or that software on their laptop or their machine because it bothers them, right? We need to make sure that we're educating them as well. But with respect to the users, it's vitally important to teach the users to spot these phishing emails. Now, phishing emails go out, a ton every day. And some of the technical solutions stop it, right? You have spam filters, you have that stuff. The really focused stuff, the really new stuff, which happens every day, gets through these. So a percentage is going to get through those. And you need all these layers in place, right? when your users get these emails, they're really your last line of defense when you're crossing the line from being proactive to now reactive. So the minute the user clicks on that link or launches that attachment, you're now relying on your antivirus or your endpoint protection. And if that doesn't catch it, you're in a restore situation. So they're your last line of defense before everything really kind of hits the proverbial fan, if you will. So it's important that they understand they don't have to be like James Bond. They don't have to be able to dissect the headers. They don't have to be able to do any of that, right? They have to be able to spot the tells that are there in pretty much any con or scam, which is really all a phishing email is. We know that 91% of successful data breaches start with a spear phishing attack, okay, or a phishing attack. We know that's happening. We know they're being targeted. So let's show them how to kind of say, when they see an email, they go, something's not quite right here. And then we need to give them some sort of an action to take, whether it's forward the email to your staff or do something else like that instead of clicking the link. And that'll go, a long ways towards protecting yourself.
Okay, so let's talk about the mechanics of it, Eric. When I come from the data backup world and data protection, and Christoph, we know that there's all sorts of DR tests and there's all sorts of preparation and there's KPIs that the IT team goes through to make sure the data is recovered within a certain period of time. But when we talk about educating the end users and we tell them to watch out for spear phishing attacks, but how? How do you educate them? What are the methods that can be used to train these guys?
Right. So traditionally, security awareness training is really the way to do it. And in some cases, security awareness training has gotten kind of a bad rap, right? But this is the kind where you take a bunch of users, you stuff them in a room, you feed them coffee and donuts, watch their eyes glaze over while you give them a death by PowerPoint sort of thing, right? And you tell them, hey, a year from now, you're going to come back and do this, check the box, and we moved on. That doesn't work. That's not very effective. So when you train your users, you need to do a few things on that. You need to make it interactive, make it something that relates to them, that's enjoyable for them. You don't want them just zoning out. You want them to be able to kind of do it on their own time, because if you shove everybody in a room at one time, who knows, Bob may be trying to work a big deal over here. That's all he's thinking about at that time, et cetera, et cetera. Once you're in the training like that, then you continue to remind them about what it is they're looking at. And we do that through simulated phishing attacks, right? And that makes a big difference for them to keep it in the forefront of their mind when they're between these training sessions. And finally, I can't say this enough to folks, we have to work from the very beginning on how we message this to the organization, from the leadership all the way down to the users. This isn't adversarial, especially when we're doing phishing with them. They need to know that this can protect them at home, because they're just as vulnerable at home to ransomware. And who really wants to have all of their pictures of their kids or grandkids? Everything's digital these days. So all that stuff can be gone in an instant if they're not careful. So we're helping them, and that gets them very engaged in things. And you never call out people unless you're in special circumstances like we are here. We call ourselves out because we're okay with that. But most cultures, you don't call out the people that failed. You really want to lift up those people that did good and spotted them and reported them.
So, Eric, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is, look, there's a classroom portion, there's an education portion, but there's a testing portion. Are you saying that it makes sense to do a simulated phishing attack maybe without their knowledge, and seeing who passes and who fails, and creating a protocol and a regimen for doing that periodically? And what about is the education, should it be part of an onboarding process?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we have a pretty good system. It's basically 4 steps. And the first thing we do is we establish a baseline. And that's where you don't tell anyone it's coming, and you do a general phishing on them, right? And you can kind of see where you're starting from, and then you can figure out, what do we need to do next? How serious do we need to get about this? How big is the risk? By continuing, well, then you do the training, right? And when you do the training, you tell them that this is coming every month, or twice a month, or pretty often. You're going to get these things, and that'll make them want to pay attention to what's going on in there in the training, because they don't want to they don't want to have an issue where they're getting hit, right? And so this really, really helps them engage in what's happening and with the training from there. And then you run those simulated phishing attacks. You make them a little bit tougher. Once they get down to where nobody's clicking on things, you need to tell them, you need to say, hey, you guys are doing a great job. Now we're going to have to step up our game to try to make them a little bit tougher on you. And you make it fun, not adversarial like that. And the difference that it makes is huge. We recommend that you phish your people at least once a month. More often if you can get away with it, if the culture is good with that and you guys are having some fun with it, do it more often, because what happens is then every email that's a little weird that comes through, they're thinking, oh, is that those guys again, and they're paying a little bit more attention before they click on things.
Okay. So you could even have like a phishing contest. Sort of gives a whole new terminology to the phishing derby or something like that.
Right. And everyone loves to get pizza when they're the best department, right? We have a lot of organizations that do that quarterly or whatever. They give pizzas out to the best department, the lowest phish rate. So it's important that you measure that too. Like I was saying, you need to know when those things drop.
Yeah. So what are the measurements? Sort of just basically, who clicked the wrong thing and how frequently, or who improved?
Yeah. So with our platform, we're able to measure a number of things. One of them is the basic click rate, or even did they receive the email? And then if they receive the email, it can show you, did they open the email? Okay, well, that's a little bit risky right there. Then did they click on a link? Well, that's really risky behavior. That's a bad thing. Or did they open an attachment? And further, in some cases, did they enable a macro? I mean, you want to talk about a 1, 2, 3, open the email, open the attachment, enable the macro. I mean, game over right there. So you can see all of that stuff in there. It's important to know, just because somebody opened an email doesn't necessarily mean they failed, because they're going to look at it for the tells. And then if they don't do anything, that's the behavior you want. You're changing the behavior, you're changing the culture, and it makes a big difference.
Okay. All right. Eric, Christoph, anything to add there, or should we shift gears a bit and talk more about backup recovery?
Well, I think you talked about KPIs, and if I may just sort of rebound on this, because one of the things we do, certainly with our solution, is we provide a very good understanding of recovery point objective and recovery time objective metrics. And I should really not say objective, it's really actuals. So you can actually input your objective and then get a measurement of what your system can actually do on the basis of regular non-disruptive testing, which is the second part of what I wanted to talk about. The KPIs are great to tell you what your exposures really are. And at that point, what you're having, to Eric's earlier point, is a business conversation. You are going to be able to go to leadership and say, look, we run regular tests, we're getting better every time, but just know that if anything happened, this is how far behind we would be. This is your exposure in terms of data loss, unless we change a few things that may require investment. But at least you're having a conversation that's based on numbers and facts and actual testing that is done non-disruptively, so you don't have to pull the plug on anything. But it's something that really is helpful. So, translate that in a context of ransomware with the upfront training you're going to do and keep on doing. You can really get to the point where you're measuring a set of KPIs where you sort of sandwich the issue, right? You become a lot better in the front end, where you don't let a lot of those ransomware events happen because you've trained people well, to the other end, where you actually have optimized your recovery capabilities so that should anything happen, and it will, at least you know what to do. You can get back on your feet, and you do so in a way that makes sense for the business with metrics that they have agreed to.
Okay, and Christoph, because we have people on the webinar who have a range of understanding of these different topics, can you just briefly describe, because these KPIs are so important, recovery time objective and recovery point objective?
Yeah, certainly. So recovery point objective, think of it of how current your data is in your backups, data currency, if you will. So how far behind am I at the point where I recover this file or this whole system? So that's RPO. And of course, the more you lose, the more exposed you are in terms of maybe having to disclose that you've lost data, or just for resuming your operation. So the shortest possible recovery point objective is important. Remember that recreation of data is not a given. You may not be able to recreate data you've lost. So that RPO is really very critical. The other aspect is recovery time objective. So if I take a look at it just from the perspective of backup and recovery, you have multiple options. You could literally have a high availability type of setup, which is something we support, where you do continuous data replication with automated failover and failback. Or you could have leveraged a public cloud to do disaster recovery as a service, or a private provider. Many options exist. It depends on your company size, your infrastructure, the investments you want to make, and again, the business metrics you're trying to hit. So the good news is that all of this enterprise class technology that was reserved only to the largest of enterprises a few years ago, it's a space I know very well, well, now it's available in the mid-market, in the SMB space as well, so and in a very usable fashion. So I think, you look at all of this and you realize that at the end of the day, the conversation shifts from one of trying to fix an issue to really trying not to have the issue in the first place, regardless of the circumstances that are creating the event.
So let's assume that hypothetical company XYZ has implemented protocols and best practices with avoiding phishing. They have done everything they possibly could, but it happens. A logical disaster, a logical corruption occurs. They're hit with a ransomware attack. So now, Christoph, we're in the realm of recovering from this. So can you talk about specific aspects of a backup and recovery system or infrastructure that make one less susceptible and more resilient to this sort of an issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of things. First of all, when the attack happens, you've identified you have a problem, you need to fix it, clean it up, right? So that is something that the backup and recovery component will not necessarily help you with. As I said, there are some security focused companies that do really well at that, and there's also a lot of technology around threat detection. Again, that's very specialized. That is perfect to really try to limit or stop the infection. So now, to your point, assuming something's happened and now we're trying to fix it, we're trying to recover. Once you're actually happy and content that you have stopped your infection, it's not spreading anymore, you can decide to either recover the whole, a whole system, or just the files that you believe you have lost. Do some QA on that, make sure it's all good. Or, the other option is to say, well, look, I think this site is really affected. It's kind of, in trouble. I'm going to fail over to another site where I have my critical applications that I'm going to get restarted. I'm just going to run my business from another site, just as if I had lost the primary site to a tornado or another problem, a blackout, whatever, you name it. So the range here is really, really wide. Now, we have customers that are SMB, mid-market customers mostly. And in the mid-market, we've seen examples of partners who actually work with end users who have been able to get them back on their feet in a couple of hours. So that's really good, even less in some cases. In other cases, it's taken a while to stop the infection, understand what happened, especially when you have those crypto lockers that spread through NAS devices and they start infecting everything and through shares, essentially. That's the way it typically propagates. So, that may take more time. And candidly, once something has started being affected, you are not necessarily sure how bad or how good the data is on that device or that file system, whatever the case may be. You may be better off just doing a bare metal restore that server, that system, again, from scratch, and that takes a little bit of time because now you have to copy everything back. But better safe than sorry in this case. You don't want to restart that machine to have forgotten something and to have another event right on the heels of the first one.
Okay, so thanks, Christoph. Now, when we were talking to Eric about simulated phishing attacks and sort of testing the resiliency of the environment to prevent engaging with a bad piece of code, my guess is that very few companies actually now are doing that, right? And so the awareness is being built, and that's part of what Eric does, is to build the awareness for people to prevent that. Now, in the world of backup and recovery, awareness about data backup has been around for a long time in disaster recovery testing. But in your experience, how many companies are out there really running tests and doing them on a regular basis and succeeding? What are you seeing out there?
Well, I think it's more than meets the eye, but I would say there may be some level of complacency with how you actually test. And the problem is that if you don't have an application or a backup and recovery infrastructure that allows you to test without disrupting operations and production, it's kind of painful. I used to joke many, many years ago when there was only tape backup, the backup always, the recovery always works or always fails, right? Either it always works because people are aware it's happening, so they're all prepared and it's great and everybody's happy and they're having coffee and donuts. Or they don't know, somebody pulls the plug and just checks it out and it's a disaster, they don't know where the tapes are, etc. So that was like 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Today it's very different. You have the ability, if you use the right type of solution, to really automate the testing of your recovery points and your recovery times and measure that. So that disruptive aspect is gone, and so there's no reason not to do that. The use of virtualization within the backup infrastructure as a tool to stand up virtual machines and just take a look and see how that last backup looks. Can you restart those systems from that virtual machine that has protected all those nodes? It's what we call virtual standby in our technology. These are great tools that you can use. So I think the testing has become a lot easier. People are doing it more often, but they're not doing it enough. And I believe that ransomware has become pretty much the big trigger this past few quarters that has made a lot of customers, large and small, revisit their backup practices and their recovery practices, more importantly.
Okay. A lot of people today are pushing their online applications to the cloud, but a lot of people are pushing data backup to the cloud. So if they've got data in the cloud, their online applications, do they help us understand, do they still need to back it up? What's the misconception there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you still need to back it up. The backup or the application provider may or may not offer a backup or an archive. So that's the case around email. You actually still need a backup somewhere, which it could be something you do on another cloud because you don't want to have anything on premise. I think the technology you have to look at is a technology that's pretty agnostic. Regardless of the source or the target, it can be on premise or in the cloud. That's, physical, virtual, you name it. The idea that you can leverage different modalities is really very key. So again, if it's your data, you have a responsibility. You have a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders or your owners. You have many compliance and legal obligations, regardless of what business you're in. And therefore, for these reasons, you have to back up and you have to archive to a large extent as well.
Okay, so let's switch now to the sort of the top 5 things that we're going to be talking about, the 5 must-have tips. And Eric, the first one that we've got here is to create a baseline phish-prone percentage. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. The baseline percentage is basically what you do is you run a simulated phishing attack. And when you do this, you do it right up front. You don't tell the users it's coming, and you do it before you train them. What this does is it kind of establishes your base point, so you have an idea of just how prone your users are to clicking on things. A lot of people are very surprised by this number, and a lot of the IT folks or the individuals that are going to be doing this, because different departments do it sometimes, they can actually use this also as leverage to go back to their leadership and say, hey, we've got 30% of the people clicking right now. This is a pretty key thing we need to focus on right now. And it helps them get funding, and it helps them get some focus and leadership buy-in on it and backing on it. But it's that first number that you're going to start by measuring these things. And it's important not to just do this without measuring. You have to measure what's going on. So It's easy to do. We offer it as a service if you want. It's free. We can do up to 100 users and get you set up with that.
Okay. All right. Cool. This isn't one of the top must-have tips, Christoph, but I do think there must be a baseline in the backup world. What do you think is a sort of a baseline thing that some sort of metric that the IT group should be aware of? Is it RTO? Is it RPO? Is it what do you think?
Yeah. I mean, those are the basics. I would say the big question is really what is critical, what isn't, or what is less, and really have this understanding and pecking order in terms of recoverability. RPO, RTO, critical systems versus less critical systems. That's really how you start the process. And not everybody does that. It's actually complicated to really think through all of the interdependencies and a critical system could have a feeder system that it depends on. So it takes a little bit of mapping of that. But once you do, then you can guarantee a coherent recovery time or recovery point really in a time frame that is going to be consistent. And that's the starting point. Then you test and improve. Ultimately, the baseline will be your first attempt at recovering. You just hope it's not when it's in a crisis. Yeah. That's why testing is important.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Let's go on to number 2. Mobilize your end users as your last line of defense. So take us through that, Eric. What do you mean by that?
Right. So, like we said, your users are your last step between being proactive and reactive when it comes to phishing attacks and these various types of attacks that come in. So teaching your users to be able to spot the tells in these cons, these scams, and that's all they really are. And they all have some sort of a tell or con in there. It's a matter of teaching them to be able to spot that, right? And once they can see that, it's really hard for them to not see it in the future. It's kind of like the FedEx logo with the arrow in there. If you've seen it, you can always see it very easily. But if you haven't, you may not realize it's there, right? So you train your users to be able to do that. Your users then are empowered and knowledgeable enough to go, something's not right with this. And that's creating the human firewall. They're making the choice to pass the packet or to basically reject it or bitbucket it, if you will. So it's kind of just a way of saying that you're putting them in that situation where they're able to spot that and take an action.
Okay. And I like that, the human firewall. Christoph, anything to add with that? I know it's a little bit more difficult because we're not talking about end users typically in the backup chain of command, so to speak. But just curious if you've got anything anything to add on that.
No, I would agree with Eric. I mean, that's where it starts, and in a sense, where it stops too. In many ways, from a backup and recovery perspective, as I said, the idea is that this is something that's really handled by the IT team. So you want to keep end users away from those backups in terms of access or administration. But obviously, having good best practices also at the workstation level is not a bad idea, giving people autonomy for simple things or simpler things in terms of recovery.
Okay. All right. So let's move on to number 3. The third must-have tip is backup data to cloud and offline storage. So take us through that, Christoph. I guess make the distinction between cloud and offline.
So there are a couple of things. First of all, you have your active backups that you will keep on premise if that's what you decide to do. And then it's always better to have a secondary site. That could be another site. It could be the cloud, which is a context here. And in essence, you can leverage this infrastructure, which is very elastic, and of course there are different types of providers to do a number of things, either some file and folders copies, and that's the baseline, but also you could literally use it as long-term backup storage, replacing tape devices, for example. Or even better, you could use, for example, an Amazon environment to do disaster recovery as a service, and there are some variations around those themes. At least with our technology, not everybody has the same capability in the market. The other aspect is offline copies. So as I explained earlier, offline copies guarantee that if something is really spreading, it's not going to affect a copy that's offline. So you can always use that and come back to it. Now, of course, that will have some slightly different RPO and RTO characteristics. That's why doing everything else to stop and immediately stop the infection and being smart about this is going to be key.
Okay. All right. So let's go on to the fourth one. It's backup related. And it is to set up restrictions on backup files to prevent modifying or deleting. Pretty self-explanatory, but Christoph, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it goes beyond that. I think, or the backup, I would say the backup repository, you want to shield it as much as you can. So there are some network, obviously, things you can do. There are a number of other best practices that we recommend so that in essence what you're trying to do is make sure that if there is some level of ransomware that's spreading around the organization, it cannot find the repository where the backups are stored. Very self-explanatory, but sometimes it's tempting to just go place a bunch of data or backup recovery points on a share. Well, if somebody else has access to that share, that could spread. So again, these are best practices in terms of protecting the protector, to be clear.
Well put. So we have the human firewall and the concept of protecting the protector. And now we're going to go to must-have tip number 5, which we spoke about a little bit before. But Eric, let's reiterate, to practice the, quote, principle of least privilege.
Yep, exactly. And this kind of goes into what we were just talking about here with Christoph here, where people don't need to have the rights to certain things. They shouldn't have it, right? We've seen it happen. I know I've heard it time and time again. There was a police department, I want to say it was Tyler, Texas. I'm not 100% sure on that. But they got infected with ransomware, and their backups, obviously, they didn't work. That was one of the main problems there. And there was another one actually that was encrypted. So they came out and they said, "Hey, we're not going to pay the ransom because we have all these great backups." And then a couple of days later, they ended up paying the ransom because their backups were on a network and accessible by the person who got infected, and therefore the backups were now encrypted. So what do you do when your backups are encrypted, right? So that's why it's so important to control who can get to what. What could be a minor inconvenience and maybe a one machine replacement or restore can turn out to be your critical infrastructure or your production servers and things like that if you're not careful. And unfortunately, I see this a lot in the SMB side especially, because it does take some knowledge. It takes a little bit of time to set up. It's hard to feel the immediate gratification of doing that. But when everything goes wrong, you're very glad that you've done it.
Okay, great. Christoph, anything to add to that? We've got some questions to get to too, so any thoughts on least privilege before we head to the questions from the audience?
I think we've covered it quite extensively so far. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Cool. So we've got a bunch of questions. We're going to try to get to them all, but if we don't get to your question, again, either someone from Arcserve or KnowBe4 will get back to you with answers. So the first one that we have here is it's a bit of a skeptic. I'm going to send this one Eric's way. Skeptical about what do I got to know, or how do I get my management to care about training us. About training the users and educating them, because they say we're too busy for training. How do I guess the question is, how do I convince my boss?
Well, you're going to kind of end up trading time for time, if you will, right? So either you're training your users not to click on these links, or you're spending time recovering from the users clicking on these links, right? So it's a matter of putting that in a context. And in many cases, you can inform them and educate them on the things that are happening out there and what's going on. There's a lot of numbers around this, like the typical ransomware infection, one machine infected costs roughly 33 man-hours total to recover from. That's from the person who isn't working to the IT guy or security guy or whoever it is that's having to run around and fix this, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. All of those things come into play. And if you're an organization, let's say, falls under HIPAA rules, HIPAA makes it very clear if ransomware hits, If your PHI is touched by the ransomware, by default, you now have a breach. Now you can argue that back, you can do that, but that's more time, more effort, more things that you have to deal with. And if it gets hit and you can't argue that out, and it's more than 500, you're having to notify the feds and the media, and nobody wants that sort of thing. So there's a real risk there, and it's a matter of helping them understand the risk and wherever possible, putting that into some numbers. That's where that fish-prone percentage really does come in and help you out. When you can go to them and go, look, we got 25% of the emails that came in that were phishing emails people clicked on. And this is the result that's happening out there with this. And, this could have cost us many hours of recovery time. That can start making a difference. It may take some time. It may not be a one-time thing. But you stay on them and you continue to educate them. I'm not big on FUD, which is fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But you do need to also make sure that they understand that the threat is real and it's really happening out there. And it's happening very often. It's really impacting businesses.
Yeah, interesting. I'm going to throw out an analogy, right? So there's a lot of companies that offer CPR training because it's an effort for employees to help one another should something negative happen in the workplace, with the side byproduct benefit of being able to educate the person to deal with this sort of emergency outside the workplace. And theoretically with this as well, you are educating that user to protect himself and with his personal data as well. So there is, I think that benefit as well.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And not only that, you think about all the devices that people bring in and their phones, and, there were like 132,000 ransomware instances on cell phones last year. Wow. So these things happen too. These people bring this in, or, if you're connecting as a USB device, things can spread that way. So it's important that the users are protected at home too with the devices they're using, or say they're VPNing in, or they're taking their laptop home on their home network. There's all of these different things that happen these days as we're kind of hypermobile and moving around and working from wherever we happen to be. So yeah, it definitely helps protect them at home, but that also benefits us in a business as well.
Yeah, sure, for sure. Okay, here's another question. This is a simple one. If we get hacked, do we pay the ransom? What is your guys' take on that?
I say by default, no. However, and I say however because if this is something that's going to damage your business or put you under or cause irreparable harm to your business, you need to look at this as a business decision, right? So the FBI's overall guidance is not to pay. But when you talk to the guys on the ground, they understand, they get it. They say, if it's a matter of paying $1,000 and, moving on with life, or, actually that's just a gamble anyways, because you don't always get the data back. But if it's $1,000 versus your doors closing, or you having to lay off half of your staff because, businesses hurt so much, that's a business decision, and you need to do that. Now, what I say is, if you do have to pay the ransom, use that as that learning experience to fix what caused you to be in that situation in the first time. I actually talked to a guy yesterday at an event I was speaking at, and he's had a customer that's been hit 4 times with ransomware. Okay, and they've paid the ransom. This was like $10,000, $12,000, $15,000 ransoms. This isn't small stuff. And the first thing I'm thinking is these guys aren't learning from their mistakes. So if you're in a situation where you have to do it, great. But take steps that you don't have to do it again, because as long as it's profitable for the bad guys, they're going to continue to innovate. They're going to continue to send this stuff out. They're going to continue to hit businesses and individuals.
All right, Christoph, how about you? What say you? Pay or no pay?
Well, similar answer. You have to do what makes sense for the business. Again, if you've prepared with the right type of backup and recovery technology, you can not pay and decide to just ignore it, fix it, clean it, and recover. We have many customers who have done that and have told us, you saved us thousands of dollars, and sometimes a lot more than that. And there are some, although it's an equal opportunity offender, I think ransomware sometimes targets, or at least in the past has targeted certain industries where, for example, healthcare, you can't really play with people's lives and patients, and so and also some of these environments appear to have a little more cash, so therefore they get hit first, and I think that just criminal activity. So by definition, they will go for the low-hanging fruit. But at the same time, I think the best thing to do is to reinforce again the ability to get back on your feet should anything happen. Again, it's ransomware today, but it could be something else tomorrow. At the end of the day, how much is your data worth? How much is your business worth? So my view is, if you're prepared, you should never have to pay. If you fail in some areas, and it may very well happen, it's such a complex set of scenarios here, do what's right for the business.
Okay. All right.
Go ahead.
Even if you pay, you may not get your data back.
And you may not get the data back.
Oh,
I think statistically, it's pretty high that you don't get it back. It's maybe not half, but not far.
Yeah, okay. We've seen some big hits. Muni out there in Northern California, the San Francisco municipal rails and stuff got hit last year on Black Friday, and it took them down. They had to open the gates and allow people to ride for free. So it happens on the big ones. I'm really glad to see instances like that where they said, no, we're not paying. We're actually going to backups, but it's still going to take time. And that's to your point of recovery time objective and things like that. It took them some time, but they knew that they may not get it back anyway. So they said, we're just going to deal with the issue now and clean up.
And that's an interesting, I'm in San Francisco, so I can tell you some people would not even ride for free anyway, but that's a different conversation. It was a very good example of how you can affect a business here, taking essentially into hostage the machines that distribute the tickets and all that. The other thing is, actually in San Francisco, we talk about ransomware and phishing and emails that get links that get clicked on. I remember a couple of mayors ago, I believe, or a mayor ago, we had an IT guy who essentially decided to pretty much block the whole IT infrastructure for the city of San Francisco by encrypting or changing passwords and passcodes, etc. So not exactly phishing, not exactly ransomware, but a form of ransom. There were some mental issues, I believe, associated with this individual. But literally, the mayor had to go negotiate with a guy in a room to get those passwords back. So remember, we're talking about ransomware today. But you could have other issues that come from within that affect your business just the same. So it's not just ransomware.
Okay, so we get time probably for about 2 more questions, and I think these are really good ones. So the first one has to do with Linux. What is basically the experience with Linux being either more susceptible or less susceptible to this sort of attack?
Yeah, I think that's it's one of the things we were talking about earlier. It's a misconception. It's as susceptible as any other environment. I think actually it's becoming more and more susceptible based on recent statistics and articles I've read.
Okay.
Anywhere that they can monetize this sort of thing, the attacks are going to happen, right? So, we're seeing them try on the Mac. We're seeing them, these things are spreading, your cell phones, pretty much anything. So, yeah, Linux isn't safe. It's safe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. So last question. I have antivirus on my workstations. Shouldn't that protect me against ransomware?
Honestly, it's an insurance. It's another layer in that risk reduction thing, right? There are some people that say that endpoint protection is dead. I don't subscribe to that theory, okay? On average, there's about a 17.5-hour lag, I think, is what I've last seen between when a new variant of something comes out and they start having signatures ready. And that doesn't include necessarily getting it all pushed out to the servers and the endpoints checking in and pulling that. So there is a lag time, but it can still be effective on some of that stuff if it's not right on the bleeding edge sort of thing. So it can help. I don't believe in throwing the baby out with the bathwater there. Again, it's just another way to reduce the risk. It's the first step after the training the user not to click in the first place. You hope that your endpoint protection doesn't catch or catches it. If that doesn't catch it, then we start looking into now how do you recover the data that was now destroyed. So there's not a whole lot after that.
Okay. And Christoph, anything to add there?
No, again, workstations are clearly a weak link in many ways because of that's one of the major entry points. So obviously it's great to have antivirus, but as Eric explained, it's hard to keep up with the new variants that come out. So, good practices, best practices, good software, and there are other security type of measures you can take and technologies you can apply in your environment. All of these combined provide for a solution, but it's not just the one thing that will that will save you from an attack.
Okay. All right, great. Well, we are just about out of time. Thank you guys very much for taking the time to speak with us today, and thank everybody for tuning in. If we didn't get to your questions, we'll have, again, somebody from KnowBe4 or Arcserve get them answered for you as soon as possible. So, for now, I want to thank everybody for watching. I want to thank Christoph Bertrand with Arcserve and Eric Krohn with KnowBe4 for joining us today. Again, this has been a Truth in IT webinar. Follow us at truthinit.com, and thanks again for watching. We want to wish you all a great day, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks again, guys.
Thank you.
All right, guys, thanks very much, and thank you all for watching. We hope you found this Truth in IT webinar to be educational and informational. We're going to be posting more Truth in IT webinars as time goes on. Just keep an eye out for truthinit.com. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook at these addresses. Thanks very much for watching. I think what you find our goal here at Truth in IT is to bring you the best in informational and educational information about best practices and any type of information that can help the IT professional do a better job and save money and make a better buying decision. Thanks very much for watching, and make it a great day.